Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Housing affordability crisis has got to be the number one topic in Canada today. The Prime Minister spoke about it last week. The Mayor of Toronto is speaking about it nonstop, and Doug Ford is trying to do some things about it, and we'll see if it has any benefit. And so I wanted to check in with the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, Aled Eb Iorwerth, who has written a couple of papers and commented a lot recently about this topic. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and good to be back with you.
Thank you. And so you've written recently about regulations in different jurisdictions across Canada. And you actually, along with Stats Canada, did a survey of these regulations and what people thought of how difficult and time consuming these regulations were. And the conclusion was that these regulatory red tape processes that you had to go through were the number one cause of the lack of housing supply.
They are certainly a very important concern. We've had a suspicion for a long time that the time delays, the regulatory burden are a concern. We were hearing a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories. We were hearing about time delays. We're also learning, getting bits of information about how it's easier in some parts of Canada and more difficult in other parts of Canada. So we had a report in 2018 that went into this, and we noted at that time that we were hearing that stuff was difficult. The process was difficult in places like Toronto and Vancouver, and relatively more straightforward in places like Edmonton. But it was all a little bit, it was more than anecdotes. There were consistent stories, but we didn't really have hardcore evidence for it. And what this survey that StatsCan carried out for us demonstrated or provided was actual hard data to say, yes, the regulatory burden does seem higher, is higher. It's not seems higher, it is higher in Toronto and Vancouver in comparison with places like Edmonton, and that time delays, uncertainty about the processes and so forth are contributing to that regulatory burden in Toronto and Vancouver. And obviously, as we all know, house prices are a major problem in Toronto and Vancouver. So there's clearly some sort of link there between regulatory burden, the lack of housing supply, the time it takes housing supply um, in Toronto and Vancouver. There's a lot of factors driving demand up, but the supply is not responsive. Regulation has something to do with that in Toronto and Vancouver.
Actually, I found the report quite shocking. You index regulatory burden in each one of these different jurisdictions across Canada, and you rank Toronto as 100, and Vancouver was slightly higher, Victoria slightly higher, but every other jurisdiction in Canada was significantly less.
Exactly.
And appreciably so, 30, 40, 50%
Yeah.
less regulatory burden.
Yeah, I mean, and to you cited the index, and your numbers are completely correct. And maybe just to put a little sort of translate that index to your listeners, what we're hearing in places like Edmonton is that it can take up to 2 years to go through the regulatory process. In Toronto, it's taking 3, 5 years plus. So these are major differences. It's not, with an initial sheet of paper in the regulations. There's a significant burden here, and the length of the process is creating a lot of uncertainty. It's adding to the costs of developing new housing, and so it's adding to this shortfall in supply.
Why do we have this excess regulatory burden? Is it of any value?
One of the things that we noted in the report is that we were not really questioning the objective of the regulations. We can have a separate discussion about that. But the problem we were highlighting is just the time it takes to go through this regulatory process. So, for example, it may be, I think there are fairly sound reasons to have greater density in our cities as an overall objective. So Having more high rise, it can lower the cost of buildings. It helps with the environment. So as an overall objective, getting more density is maybe a good thing. The problem that we're highlighting is the process of getting there. So if there's just to make it up, a 5-year process to get to that density, then okay, there's a little bit of a problem here. Is there a way of getting to these same objectives, but using a less burdensome process, something that takes less time and has greater certainty in it?
I think I found the report really quite interesting and sobering to read. You, as I mentioned, you give a detailed breakdown of the results at every census metropolitan area across the country, and you deem Toronto and Vancouver the worst. Regrettably, you don't break down the different areas in Toronto, because I do think that it would be very helpful to understand if there's any cities in the GTA where I think the housing crisis, and in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver, where the housing crisis is probably more profound. Because in Vancouver, you actually do, to a certain extent, because you rank Greater Vancouver at 100, but you say the city of Vancouver is worse than that at over 100. But you don't do that in Toronto, and I think it would be really helpful for you to do that. Here's one of the statements you make. Long approval times for new developments can make building projects more costly. Among the surveyed land use regulation, the time it takes to approve new projects, the approval delay index, is the most important survey factor explaining differences in housing affordability across regions. It's interesting that you go through all the different types of things that regulators, municipalities can do, and things they're asking for, and demands they're making. But approval delays came out as the most important issue, just delay by itself.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure that some people always appreciate how costly delay is. The fact that you have to put your initial capital at work, and then you have to wait until you get regulatory approval. It's just the amount of uncertainty this is creating, I think, is enormous. And I I think my suspicion, I haven't asked the developers this, but my suspicion is if they were told, well, you have to pay X dollars and you have to pay it tomorrow, but we'll give you an approval in 2 days. I think they would much prefer that sort of world than this doubt and uncertainty of having to pay a smaller amount, say 2 years in the future, and they don't know what's going to happen. So I think this having the needs or the imperative to commit capital for a long period of time without knowing what's going on, I suspect it deters a lot of investors. It deters a lot of developers in saying, well, this is just a little bit too risky, so maybe we'll keep to what we have on the land currently and see what happens.
And I guess,
And
well,
I think this is particularly the case this year because of the macro uncertainty that we're facing. So we're hearing this year in particular that there's a lot of delays.
and interest rates significantly higher. So when you think about the cost of delay costs a lot higher when interest rates are fourfold, fivefold
Yeah.
higher than they were before. But you don't just ask people about and do the survey on regulatory burden. You also do it based on housing affordability. And you certainly find a correlation, if not a causation, of the extra regulatory burden adds to the lack of housing affordability. Every single city that you've got with a low regulatory burden has got more affordable housing.
Yeah, it's clear that there is a link here. So, as I mentioned earlier, Edmonton, their processes seem to work a lot better. There are other factors in Edmonton, like they have a large rental sector. So it seems that within Edmonton that they have greater flexibility. There may be issues in Edmonton in terms of getting sprawl. So there is a downside, but at least they do get the housing supply, and that helps with affordability. So it's a part of our long-standing messaging that there are lots of reasons demand for housing is going up. but the response to that is more housing supply, and we need that housing supply in order to get to affordability.
We're chatting today about our housing affordability crisis in Canada with the Deputy Chief Economist of CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and a recent report that they've released about housing affordability relative to local municipal regulation. And it finds that, number one, the time that it takes to get approvals is the number one cause of regulatory burden. And then they talk about a whole bunch of other things that the regulation does. And then they compare it to housing affordability. And there's no question that there's a correlation, that the more red tape you got to jump through, the more expensive your housing is. Sounds pretty obvious, but it's interesting to have the facts. We're going to take a break for some messages and back with Alid Ab Iorwerth in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Alid Ab Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist of CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. He's a very smart gentleman about lots of economic issues, but he's been focused a lot on housing and housing affordability of late. And CMHC and Stats Canada have recently issued a report on housing affordability relative to regulation, and found that, number one, the time that it took to get housing approved was the number one impact on housing affordability. Then they talk about a bunch of regulatory impacts. And Alid, I think we'll come back to this in a minute, but the implication of this is shocking, because in this report, you also talk about housing prices relative to income. And you say that the Greater Toronto and Greater Vancouver have the highest house price to income ratios of 9.25 and 14.19, while Saskatchewan and Manitoba are just over 3 times. And, you know, when I graduated from university, and it was a little while ago, but when I graduated from university, I remember my father telling me that you can afford a house 3 times your income. I don't know where that ratio came from. It'd be interesting to try to figure it out, because at the time, interest rates were a lot higher. So I'm not sure how I could afford it 3 times my income then. And today, it's 3 times higher in Toronto at 9.25. What's gone wrong?
A whole host of issues, and it's not in Canada. It's in a lot of cities around the world. So I'm not sure that anybody has completely figured out. Well, maybe we do have a story about what happened, but figuring out the solution, I'm not sure that anybody's got to that stage yet. But we are suddenly facing a crisis in the housing system. To dig in more into your question, there's been sustained growth in population. There's been sustained growth in incomes, and we have been facing very low interest rates. So demand for housing has been increasing a lot at least the last decade, maybe even close to 2 decades. And I think the problem in practice is that there has been systematic under planning of that increase in demand. There hasn't been the realization of how much demand for housing there is, and this has been built into structural undersupply and insufficient planning for that growth. So you have all of that growth happening. The supply system of housing is really sluggish, and we are where we are today as a result of that.
But if it's 3 times the cost of income, 3 times the amount of housing prices to income that one could typically have afforded a 3 multiple a generation ago, and it's now at 9.25 today, how can young people ever afford to buy in? How can newcomers ever afford to buy in? How can renters ever afford to get out of the rental environment and buy homes? It seems like the only people that can afford homes are the people that have already got overly inflated homes to start with.
I completely agree. So the only thing I could do is pile onto your argument. I mean, a lot of people and a lot of your listeners will be really paying attention to the home ownership market, but the rental market, I mean, the rental market is full. So we released a report earlier this year. Vacancy rates now in the GTA and looking, other parts like Hamilton, the vacancy rates are almost zero. They're about 1%, 2%. It's the same in Vancouver, and these are not healthy vacancy rates. So there's some sort of rule of thumb that maybe a vacancy rate of 3 to 4% would be a comfortable rental market, but the vacancy rates at the moment are close to zero for practical purposes. The other thing that report found was that when a unit is vacated and so a new tenant moves in, we're seeing rent increases of about 20% in parts of the GTA and Vancouver. And this to us is a clear sign of undersupply in the rental market. Um, to go back to your original question, how can people afford to be in home ownership, the young, the newly arrived? They can't. So normally what happens in that circumstance is they will go into rental. But the problem we now have is that the rental system is full as well. So it's a massive crisis in home ownership and rental. And we also clearly have a problem with very low income households. So the social housing is full. It's this just chronic undersupply of housing across the board.
We talked a little bit a couple minutes ago about this developers restriction index, which is a key factor of understanding differences in housing affordability according to your study. And you say this includes survey questions on fees, environmental assessments, and mandated criteria. Interestingly, you conclude the density restriction index has the weakest association with affordability differences in Canadian municipalities. I'm astounded at this conclusion. Last year there was this housing affordability task force that the provincial government had that had 57 regulations, and a lot of them were about reducing a lot of these things. And a lot of the bills that the provincial government has recently issued, Bill 23, Bill 109, I don't even know what all the other numbers are on things to reduce the conservation authority's ability to have impact on approvals, restrictions, and reductions on development fees. A whole bunch of different things, which I think, frankly, sound like they make sense to reduce the red tape. But yet, your analysis says that it doesn't actually have a lot of impact. It's just time. It's just time that has an impact on affordability. It's shocking. What that effectively says is municipality, you can have all the red tape you want. You can have all the restrictions you want. You can do all that stuff you want. Just do it quickly.
Well, I think that's one argument, but the emphasis I would make is that everything is relative. So when we were looking at this index, time delay was relatively more important, but the other factors have an impact as well. So even if decisions were made in a week, um, I think that would help enormously if decisions could be made extremely quickly. But we have to, so that would be solving the biggest problem. But even if decisions were made in a week, I suspect that there would still be problems there. So we're hearing about some of the costs of these infrastructure spending, for example, that is passed on through development fees to basically new home buyers. So, and these in the case of Ontario are enormous. So I think it's a relative statement. So maybe the priority should be to get speed, get actions taken faster. But even if that was solved, I think problems would remain.
You've recently reported as well housing prices in different jurisdictions around the world. And you showed that the United States housing prices went down since the Great Recession, but housing prices in Canada have increased, Australia, New Zealand as well, and that our housing prices are twice the level relative to income that they are in most European countries. Why is that?
These international comparisons are really tough. And to paint a broader picture of what you just said, it really seems to be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, in comparison to the rest of the world. So it's Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland. So I, I haven't dug enough into knowing exactly why the reason for this, but it may be that just there's a problem with very large cities. And if you have a large proportion of your population in these large cities, the country as a whole is going to show up a lot worse. But it's clearly the case. So point one is there's a problem in housing supply in these large cities: Toronto, Vancouver, Melbourne, Auckland in the U.S., San Francisco, Boston, New York, London in the UK, and so forth. Now, some cities are performing better. In Canada, I would point to again to some of the prairie cities. In the US, you can look at Atlanta, Phoenix, Houston. So there are some places that have much greater affordability and are seeing the population growth as a result. The problem, coming back to your question, Toronto, Vancouver in Canada, these are major centers of economic growth, and the housing situation now is putting that economic growth at risk. Um, so, like again, I'm often asked who is doing this housing system well, and I do struggle to answer that question because I'm not sure that anybody has quite cracked this nut.
So there's a very smart gentleman from something called the Harvard Growth Lab who's done a report that compares housing affordability, regulatory restrictions, etc., timing for approvals in common law, Anglophone, English-speaking countries versus civil law and European countries, and says it's something about our legal system that allows you to oppose that is the problem. And he says that United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand have got twice the level of housing inaffordability as most other jurisdictions. And he says it's our legal system that allows us to oppose, NIMBYism that allows us to oppose, regulations that allow us to oppose. And he says that other jurisdictions have got something right, at least in regards to housing.
There may well be something to that because traditionally, Quebec in Canada has had a lot more affordability. There are other things going on. So the rental system in Quebec and in some of those continental European countries, the rental system is a lot bigger, which does help with affordability. But you may well be onto something there. There is something going on in the Anglosphere, shall we say, that is really opposes new housing. And so if you are in some parts of these countries, I mentioned Atlanta, Edmonton, there's less opposition. So that's a little bit of a counter argument, but the challenge in those places is that you don't get the density. So you get massive amounts of sprawl in those cities, which leads to its own set of issues. So I guess the challenge is it possible to get increased density plus affordability? I don't think anybody has done that yet.
The opening paragraph of this report was frankly shocking to me because it quoted a number of 3.5 million new units that we need in Canada in the next 6.5 years by 2030 for affordability to be restored. I hadn't heard that 3.5 million unit number before. You and I spoke a couple of months ago, and you had quoted a number of, I think it was 1.8 million incremental units that needed it to be built in Southern Ontario by 2020. And then Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, has been using this 1.5 million unit number, and they've allocated that out by jurisdictions around the Greater Toronto Area. But that's 1.5 million units, not incremental units on top of what otherwise would be built. Looks like we've got an impossible problem here. In Mississauga, as an example, we're building something like 10 or 20% of the target. And so every year, every month that we don't build, we get further behind. And I think right now, we aren't building anywhere close to the target. How are we going to solve this problem?
That's a very tough question. We've been concentrating a lot on getting the question right. So, and I think the way you posed it is the right question. How do we get this built? Uh, I think the challenge has been that people have been struggling on identifying the right question and whether they're onto the right cause for the problem of affordability. So for a long time, there was a lot of preoccupation with foreign buyers. People acted on that, and that ended to being fairly ineffective, I think, as a means of getting to
Seems
affordability.
like it was a big political ballyhoo for a while, but it had no impact.
Right. And so this gets to, okay, what is really the problem? And we've been saying for a while that the problem is the lack of supply. So whereas a lot of action has been taking place on other parts of housing, I'm not sure that there has been comprehensive action, large scale on supply. And so now we're moving into that phase. I think we are we have increasingly persuaded, and I think everybody was persuaded that supply is a problem. And so that was the first part of the challenge, I think, was get people to ask the right question and identify the right cause of the problem. So now coming back to your question, the challenge is how do we do that? And I think that's what we need to concentrate on now. And there's a whole suite of issues or suite of policies that probably need to be looked at. I don't think there's a silver bullet. It's taken us a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take us a long time to get out, and we need all sorts of policies, all hands on deck. We need change in the government, all levels of government, change in the construction industry development, more innovation, productivity, policy changes, everything. It's going to be a huge effort, but affordability now is such a crisis that we really need this across the board effort.
In 2018, CMHC came out with a fairly major report on housing that you reference in this most recent report, and you track pricing between 2010 and 2018, which doubled in Vancouver and doubled in Toronto, and I think it's only gone up since then. And you have graphs that compare supply versus demand, and it's just obvious that demand has been escalating fairly dramatically and supply's gone down. You compare housing built a generation ago in the 1960s, and we built more than twice as many homes per capita as we're building today. So, you're a far smarter, more qualified, educated gentleman economics than I, but I did take basic economics 101, and I think a lot of my listeners probably have taken some sort of economics. Supply and demand was sort of the first thing you learned in the first week of economics. And we've dramatically reduced supply. Yes. That's got to be the issue. Why is this a question?
I completely agree with you. It is obvious that demand for housing has been going up and up. There's a whole range of reasons of that: immigration, income, interest rates. But if demand is going up and up and up, the only thing, if you want affordability, then supply has to go up, and it hasn't done that. So it's clear for me where the problem is, and that's where we need to concentrate the policies at the moment.
We're chatting tonight with the Deputy Chief Economist of Canadian Mortgage and Housing, Alid Iorwerth, who is a very smart guy. He's penned and participated in several different reports recently. He's a prolific commenter on LinkedIn and in the media. And the reports that CMHC comes out with and the comments from Alid are really quite helpful in understanding this problem. There's a couple of other issues that he addresses in recent reports in regards to seniors, rental housing, and other issues. We're going to talk about that when we come back. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Alid Iorwerth, who is the deputy chief economist at Canadian Mortgage and Housing, CMHC. We're talking about housing affordability. It's really, quite a topical issue. I think that almost every political jurisdiction right now, municipally, provincially, and federally, are talking about it. I think everyone at their dinner tables are talking about it. And yet we don't seem to be doing much to solve it. The CMHC has come out with a major report recently that says that the time of approval is the number one negative impact on housing affordability. And red tape and restrictions are important, contribute, but not as much as just how long it takes to get approval. And I've been arguing this for a while. I think municipalities have got to wake up and realize that they're causing an unbelievable problem for their citizens, for our country, and jacking up housing prices. And it's because they're too involved. It takes too long. And our people don't value it. And our housing affordability crisis is increasing because of it. Ali, you had a couple of other reports that were kind of interesting. You talked about seniors being unable to downsize and being sort of stuck in their oversized homes. What? I don't understand this. What causes this?
Well, the suspicion, though, well, it's more than a suspicion. You look at large chunks of Toronto, so not right downtown, but some of the, shall we say, the inner suburbs, or north of Bloor, for example. You have a lot of single detached housing there, but you've also been seeing in the data quite a lot of population decline. What seems to be happening is over the decades, as the population ages, children move out, the parents stay there. Maybe it's down to one person in the housing as they become elderly. So you have fairly low density in single detached housing, and that is in very expensive housing. So what we would normally expect to see happening is that some of those people might move out into housing that's more suitable for them. So if you're over 80, climbing stairs may not be recommended. But so the house is perhaps no longer suitable for them. It's maybe not close to transit, and so there's a lot of reasons for the elderly to move out of their housing of that particular house. The suspicion I would have is that, however, they would want to stay in their community. They have a lot of friends, their support networks in their local community. But because of the zoning regulations, there's no higher density multi-unit structures that they can move into with accessibility requirements and so forth. So they're staying in their home, and it's slowing this whole process of the evolution of the housing system of the elderly moving into condos or into other housing that's more appropriate to them. It's leading to population declines in these, like, I don't know, Rosedale, these sorts of areas. So it's part of the process of slowing the evolution towards affordability. Over time, what you would hope, these single detached housing would be vacated. The value of the land that they're sitting on is enormous, and so these should be redeveloped into greater density, more apartment structures over time, as a normal part of the evolution of the housing system. But this is not happening because many seniors and elderly can't find housing that's more appropriate to them in their community.
My own mother ran into this. Her local church was critically important to her life, her social life. She played bridge a couple times a week. She was part of a book club. Her social life was critically important in the very local community that she lived in, and the only condominiums that were available were miles away, and she didn't want to move, and she didn't want to pay a huge amount of money to move into a senior's home when she didn't need that extra care. And so she ended up staying in a 4-bedroom house two-story, four-bedroom house that she loved, and I'm very thankful that she was able to. But because there was no other reasonable housing options nearby.
Exactly. And so we have these vast swathes of Toronto, Vancouver, very relatively close to downtown, and they're all single detached housing. And from a housing perspective, it doesn't make sense because these areas should be redeveloped into higher density housing, more apartment structures. They don't necessarily all have to be 40, 50 stories, just more density in general. But th this is prevented by the current zoning rules. And the suspicion I have is that, as I said, does not make sense from an overall housing perspective, but it's not clear to me that it makes sense for the individual elderly person either. So, I, an elderly person in a single detached house probably does not make sense for them either, given the challenges of stairs and mobility and so forth, and the need to care for the entire house. But they don't have options at the moment, and so it's creating a lot of challenges for them as individuals, but it's creating challenges for the housing system overall as well.
You didn't write this report, but you commented on it, which I found kind of interesting. It was a report about the impact of parking regulations, and the title of the article was "Build Less Housing for Cars and More for People." And it said that parking requirements help trigger an extinction level event for bite-sized infill apartment buildings like row houses, brownstones, and triple deckers. And I've found this as well, is that city regulations on parking requirements seemed extreme, and a lot of them have gone away recently or been reduced. But why did we think that the market couldn't decide what the right amount of
Yeah.
parking was? That red tape regulators had to decide.
Yeah, I really agree with your last point there that a lot of this should have been left to the market to fix. So, imposing parking regulations, it seems excessive. So, from a purely economics point of view, uh, if parking were not included in an apartment structure and the buyers really valued parking, that would have been reflected in the price of the apartment structure. And the reverse would be the case. People would be willing to pay a lot more for an apartment if parking were included. So this could have been left to the market. So I really don't see why some of these regulations were imposed. And it also now leads to a lot of opportunities in terms of these vast parking areas that are all over the city. I don't think these are needed anymore, and they need to be rezoned for housing. Now, that whole process of rezoning is again difficult. So there's a lot of marginal opportunities here that could create a lot of housing.
There's another interesting article that you commented about that said it's time to build more public housing, and it's the issue that the solution to affordable housing problem that no one wants to discuss. And it talked about how the most critical issue is social housing at scale, and that not more politicians want to discuss this desperate need for incremental social housing. What do you think of that issue?
I, we've started talking about CMNC about a twin crisis. The crisis that you and I have been talking about now is mostly related to middle class Canadians, places to rent, places to buy, places to own, and so forth. But we are concerned about the crisis for very low income households, for those made vulnerable, for the homeless, and so forth. So, and that's a whole, there is a crisis there as well. The solutions are probably more complicated, more varied. Um, so one aspect is more social housing, but social housing can be very expensive. And there are a lot of other challenges with social housing. But clearly, having more supply in that of social housing would help with some of the crisis of affordability affecting low income households. But there's probably a suite of other measures as well. So economists in general are more favorable to some sort of benefit like the Canada Housing Benefit that directly helps households with their housing costs. It's probably cheaper than having more social housing. So there's a suite of measures, each with their own pluses and minuses, that need to be explored in this area. But clearly, I mean, for example, one of the problems of providing more of the Canada Housing Benefit is that it risks being translated into higher rents because there's no supply. So we keep on coming back to the
You give
same
people more
issue
money and they just give it to the housing, the
to the
rental
landlord.
prices.
Yes.
Build
So
Build came out recently and said that one of the problems was GST, HST on purpose-built rental, and they were calling for its elimination.
I think we have such a crisis at the moment with housing that we have to explore all sorts of policies, including taxation. So we clearly need more rental supply, and if that includes tax subsidies, or tax preferences or tax expenditures, I think that has to be looked at. I mean, that leads to question affecting the broader tax system. But we clearly have such a problem of housing affordability that all policies need to be looked at.
You also commented that construction labor and the lack of it is a problem.
Yeah, and it's one problem after another. So, I mean, one concern I would have I mean, coming back to what we discussed earlier with municipal regulations, suppose that the time to approve regulations were dramatically improved overnight. So this would give a huge spur to the building, the development industry to build more stuff. But do they actually have the labor to do that? Which is what we hear that is that labor is in short supply at the moment. And it's one of the reasons why housing starts this year are not performing all that well. There's been supply chains issue during COVID with getting materials, but now there are concerns over labor. You cited Build. They have other studies saying that there's a huge swathe of the labor force that is facing retirement. So we need labor. And last week there were immigration changes announced that maybe more skilled workers could be coming in. So again, there's a shortage of skilled workers, but maybe there are also issues um, that need to be looked at within the industry in terms of regulation of those occupations.
I toured a condominium under construction just a couple of weeks ago, and I was shocked, and I guess I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked at how labor intensive it is. I saw this
Yeah.
one lady down on her knees with D-pads on that was fitting in pipes in what would be the kitchen, and there were like dozens of pipes for the sink, for the dishwasher, for other things that she was fitting in from one to another. I saw this other gentleman that was up on a ladder doing electricity in the ceiling. I saw someone else up on stilts that was doing plaster. It's an incredibly labor intensive, detailed work. And then over on the other side was this massive puddle from a rainstorm. We got to deal with inclement weather. I spoke with someone just yesterday that said they were building at a ski mountain, and they had to finish by October because there was too much snow between October and April to do any construction. It's almost as if there's been a lack of industrialization, of modernization, of advancement in construction processes.
Absolutely agreed. So, among academic economists, there's a new paper that's just come out in the US where these very high-profile economists have really taken apart the productivity statistics across industries in the US. And they find that productivity growth in the construction industry has been a disaster in the US. It's just there's nothing going on there. So we seem to be seeing digitization, computerization, automation everywhere except in construction. So, and this is a U.S. phenomena, and I suspect with our smaller market in Canada, it's even a bigger problem in Canada. So, there are some people talking about doing differences, so like more prefabrication of parts. I was at a conference last year with the Quebec wood industry, and they're talking about can they um, move to more mass production of wood products rather than having everything so customized. And they were pressured into action because they were some Canadian companies were using European technology rather than Canadian or Quebec technology. So there is pressure to change, but it seems that construction is a very slow business to change. So that comes back to my earlier appeal that it's not just for government to improve, but it's also for the building, construction, development industries to improve as well.
We're chatting tonight with the Deputy Chief Economist for the CMHC, Alid Iorwerth, who has really educated us in a bunch of the problems that we've got in our society today in regards to restrictions on housing, the time it takes to get approval, and the impact of these far greater housing prices relative to income that we have today than we had a generation ago. And what are we going to do about it? We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us. We're back at the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Alid Iorwerth, the Deputy Chief Economist of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, is my guest. We're talking about the housing affordability crisis in the Greater Toronto Area in Canada today. Alid, I want to ask you a question, if I could, because I just don't understand this. You know, zoning regulations were put in place sometime after, I understand, World War II, maybe a little bit before that, to try to separate out heavy industry from residential areas primarily. And even back in the 1960s, Jane Jacobs, in a preeminent book called The Life and Death of American Cities, spoke about how zoning actually wasn't terribly helpful. It was the built cities that were the most interesting because they were organic. We've got, this huge infrastructure of planning departments at cities, at regions, at provinces, at conservation authorities, at heritage areas, forestry places. Does it do any good? Because it seems that, frankly, it's led to this massive increase in housing prices. And I wonder if this regulation isn't actually needed today. You've got this provincial government that's talking about no heights potentially around, no height limits potentially around major transit zones that are coming in the province and putting in ministerial zoning orders that are doubling the density that the prior city processes had previously approved, doubling, not like a 10% increase, but Lakeview in downtown in southern Mississauga, up here in Ontario, in place after place, the province in their wisdom is doubling the density. It seems to me that municipal governments and their zoning regulations and their planning departments are the problem, and I wonder whether they've done any good.
I think we have to, and it's a good thing that you bring up the history because these zoning regulations may have had a use many years ago. But it's no longer clear that they are needed. So we still have well, maybe I'll put it another way. If you go back in history, you used to have extremely polluting industries, the smoke, the pollution coming out of them, and there was an argument that you should concentrate all of this pollution in one area and have the housing and people in another area so they wouldn't suffer from the smoke. So there was this division between employment lands and lands for housing and for occupation. But given the whole evolution of industry, of mass manufacturing, all of that has changed, all of it is gone. Does this separation between employment lands and housing make sense anymore? We're talking much more construction these days of multi-use. So you might have a structure that's half hotel, half housing, but with retail as well. You may have buildings with offices and housing in them. So the whole economy is becoming more flexible, work from home. And so these historic regulations are they needed anymore? Are they fit for purpose? I think we need to take a close look at these regulations and see whether they make sense.
I agree. One last question. Some people are resistive to a lot of these changes that we're talking about because they frankly have built up big net worth in their home ownership. But you're a smart guy. If you've got an overinflated home, are you actually really richer? Because if you sell that home, you got to live somewhere, and you're going to be buying an overly inflated home.
Yeah.
And if housing prices went down by 20 or 30%, so you actually lost net worth, but you could sell your home and move into a cheaper home that was also 20 or 30% cheaper, you'd still be able to buy the same home. You're just buying it with $1 million rather than $2 million. And so if housing has given us this perception that we're a lot richer, but all housing that we would ultimately move into is similarly overpriced, are we actually richer?
I think that's a completely fair point, and I agree with you. I mean, yes, it's wealth on paper, but even if you invest in the stock market, you only get the money once you've sold the stock. And I think the same analogy holds in housing. You have a lot of wealth on paper. Does it actually help with your income, with your standard of living? Some people use housing as a way of saving for retirement, but that implies that you need to sell the home. Arguably, you can get a HELOC or something, but uh, it does seem to be a little bit too much of a game that having this wealth on paper, and so that's why we're starting to think about what's going to happen when we have the baby boomers and the elderly downsizing en masse. It's not this year, not next year. Some point this is going to happen, and so does all of this wealth on paper actually exist? It's an open question, I think.
Alid Iorwerth, Deputy Chief Economist of Canadian Mortgage and Housing, thank you so much for joining us. If I could just finish our chat with one thought, and I think that the time to get approval is the number one issue that you've identified in your report. And I really think it is. And I think that municipal politicians and municipal planning departments really need to look at themselves in the mirror and wonder if they've been a help to the housing situation or a detriment to the housing situation and have created the housing crisis. And I think that there probably is a rationale to make sure that we don't build crap that's going to fall down. But I'm not sure that there is a need for all the regulations that are involved in. And I'm for sure not I'm not of the opinion that they need all the time. They need to consider, review, and approve all the housing that we've got. And I think that the number one thing that they could do from a competitive standpoint to make their economies and their jurisdictions more dynamic is try to be faster than the neighborhood, the city next door, and be that city that can get approvals for your housing, positive or negative, because even if you get turned down, at least and you can take your money and put it somewhere else. But get those approvals in like half or 25% of the time that Toronto or Vancouver takes to approve. And if we actually had competition on who can review things more quickly, created a marketplace in regulatory approval, not by approving things that shouldn't get approved, things that are going to fall down. I'm not suggesting that in any way, shape, or form, but doing the review far faster, I think we would have a far better city to live in. We would have cheaper housing. We would have more choices, and people that are young that want to buy, renters that want to move out of rental into housing, and And importantly, there's 1 million people a year that we're enticing into our country to immigrate would actually have a place to live. That's my final thought. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Alid. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.